Hello everyone, this is Professor Reimer. This video is for my world history class on Wednesday, February 10th and Thursday, February 11th. It is our Unit 6 writing assignment. In this lesson, we will evaluate the impact of the Columbian Exchange by writing a 2-paragraph essay. As always, let's get started with a preview. I want you to list as many definitions as you can for the word influential, and I'll tell you why in just a minute. So pause the video and list them. All right, so I found this interesting article in Merriam-Webster. So influence may seem like a ho-hum word, but its history is heavenly. I didn't know this. This is really interesting. The word first referred to a celestial fluid that was believed to flow from the stars. As this fluid reached the earth, it supposedly affected the actions of the planet's inhabitants, especially the human ones. Interestingly, the word influenza has the same origin. The medieval Latin word influentia, it was for a time believed that epidemics were caused by unusual conjunctions of the planets. Wow, words are fascinating. In modern use, the noun typically refers to the power to change or affect someone or something. You guys were probably thinking of influencers on social media. That was probably the first thing that came to your mind when you heard the word influence. This word, right, especially the power to cause changes without directly forcing those changes to happen. Influence can also refer to a person or thing that affects someone or something in an important way. Social media influencers. The noun had been used for more than 200 years before the verb use developed. As a verb, influence typically means to affect or change someone or something in an indirect but usually important way. Important way. That's what I want you to remember as we go back to our slideshow. So here's why I asked you that question. Our prompt today is, what was the most influential impact of the Columbian Exchange and why? So a synonym, right, for influential, most important, right, impact. And that is for you to decide the criteria, what makes it influential or what makes it important. That's what you're going to have to do. That your task is to evaluate the impact. So as a teacher, I get to choose my criteria about how I'm going to evaluate you or grade you. So you get to choose the kind of criteria you want to use to evaluate the impact of the Columbian Exchange. You could focus more on the real positives that we've talked about in class or the real negatives. So what I want to do in this video is not only explain how to write this, but I'm also going to review some of the key features of the Columbian Exchange. So first, I'm looking for a 2-paragraph essay. Remember, in the intro, you need to contextualize and write your thesis statement, and then in the body paragraph, include evidence to support that thesis statement. In the last writing assignment, I introduced you to counter arguments and our thesis formula. That formula doesn't quite work for this question, so I've reworded it. I do still want you to write or have a counter argument, right? That's what's going to go first, that X statement. And then you only need to have one main point, because I'm only looking for a 2-paragraph essay. But you need that counter argument so you can explain how your main argument, whatever you decide is the most influential, is so much more important than this other one. And I'll talk more about that at the end. All right. So remember, in a contextualization, you want to describe who, what, where, and when, right? So basic, the W's of history. And what you should be describing is that keyword from the prompt. So let's review what the Columbian Exchange was. It is, or was, the transfer of plants, animals, diseases, and people between the Old World and the New World. And you see one of the devastating impacts of the Columbian Exchange on Native Americans, and that is diseases from the Europeans. All right. Also, remember the context in which the Columbian Exchange is happening. It gets its name from the voyages of Columbus, but he was not the only one, as this map shows. The Europeans were making numerous voyages across the Atlantic, into the Indian Ocean, across the Pacific, as they searched for routes, trading routes to East Asia and Southeast Asia, South Asia. They wanted direct access to those trading routes. They bumped into the Americas, and this leads to this transfer, but it went both ways. It didn't just go from Old World to New World. It also went from New World to Old World, as we'll explain. And it happened on nearly all the continents, right? It wasn't just a transfer from Europe to, let's say, Brazil, but also to North America, also to Africa. Look, these are Portuguese holdings here in Africa. It also was a transfer to Southeast Asia, South Asia, where the Europeans were gaining colonies. All right, so what were some of the impacts? Remember, you're choosing the most influential. Now let's talk about just what were some of the impacts. This is like your exhaustive list about what you could choose to be your most influential. All right, on the Americas, let's talk about some of these environmental impacts, and they were huge because the Europeans brought with them their crops from the old world. They wanted to have the same food they had back home, chiefly wheat, as well as grapes to make wine. Why are those so important? Because you need those for Catholic Mass, right? Bread and the wine. Well, the planting of these crops devastated the soil, right? It led to erosion and depletion and deforestation, right? So you're cutting down the trees for crop land, as you see in that picture there. But these plants are highly exhaustive to the soil, and the soil never seen these plants before, and so it leads to the destruction of many of the native species. Also, the Europeans brought with them unknowingly many of the pests from the old world, and these pests had no natural enemies, predators in the new world, and so the native species dramatically decline. I've been talking about more land under cultivation. Let me also say that it was a specific kind of farms that they're making on in the New World, right? Primarily haciendas and plantations. And there's a key difference. Haciendas were these large land holdings that were supplying the food for the workers, whether that be in the mines or on the plantations. Plantations were primarily focused around these cash crops, chiefly sugar, right? So it's not a world of the small farmer who's self-sufficient. No. This is a pseudo-capitalistic kind of farming. But it wasn't just Europeans who were bringing their crops. It was also Africans. The slaves were bringing their knowledge of rice cultivation and okra, as well as chickens. A sad story actually comes from South Carolina, where slaves had begun to plant rice as a way to supplement their food, and the white plantation owners were looking around for a cash crop because sugar doesn't grow well in Carolinas, and they saw that rice does, and so instead of having more food for themselves, slaves were forced to grow rice for their masters. So huge numbers of environmental effects on the Americas. Less in number on Africa, but perhaps more important, you're going to get to choose as part of this question, right? So food crops from the Americas are introduced into Africa, and they are still a staple of food in Africa today. This is primarily manioc or cassava, which you see there, and maize, which is the scientific term for corn. So these new food crops are planted in Africa. They're also planted in Asia, where corn and sweet potatoes become very popular. In China, especially sweet potatoes, which you see there. In fact, American foods now make up 20% of the food grown in Asia, and peanuts also began to be planted. What's so great about peanuts is they grow in really sandy soil, which was not being used at the time, and so that's why new lands become cultivated. Peanuts were able to grow on lands that weren't really being cultivated up until that point. Similar process is happening in Europe, where also maize is being introduced, as well as the potato, which you see there. So new lands are coming under cultivation because these crops grow in different conditions than the native crops. And they're not only fed to people, but they're also fed to livestock. So, all right, we've been talking a lot about these environmental effects of the Columbian Exchange. So let's pause here. I want you to read this question, choose the best answer, and then come back to the video to hear the right answer. All right, which of the following was the most responsible for these changes? We just were talking about slave labor and sugar. You might have thought encomiendas and corn, but it was really sugar and the slave labor that was used to produce it that greatly changed the cultivation methods in Latin America. They had already been producing corn. That wasn't new, but sugar, that was drastically new, I should say. All right, now let's turn to demographic effects. These are effects that happened to people, and specifically populations of people. For the Americas, it's tragic. I mean, look at this chart of the population of the Native Americans in black, from an estimated 22 million in 1500 to less than three centuries later. So it's devastating to the population. They suffered from starvation. They suffered from death of these diseases to which they had no immunity. But the Europeans are not just bringing their diseases, but they're also bringing themselves, and they're staying. And so you see a rise in red there of new populations in the Americas. We talked about the caste, the system, all right, of Peninsulares and Creoles and Mestizos and mulattoes. And so you have totally new social structures in the Americas as a result of this coming of people, sometimes forced, and then the mixing of those people. Huge demographic effects on the Americas. On Africa, there's also demographic effects as a result of the Atlantic slave trade. 12.5 million, mostly men, taken, of which 1.8 died in that Middle Passage. And so what it does is drastically destabilizes society. Society is deprived of some of their healthiest men of childbearing age. And so you see the population not increase as much as it should have. It doesn't decline, largely, sadly, and ironically, as a result of those new food crops that we were just talking about. But as you can see in this image, the slave trade was participated, or Africans participated in this slave trade, and not just Europeans. So you see here Africans selling a slave to this European, and the act of getting more slaves became more and more violent, right? So slaves were primarily from prisoners of war, so you needed to go on more wars to get more slaves, so you could trade to the Europeans to get more of the guns that you relied on to maintain your strength and in order to gain more slaves. And so it's a vicious cycle that destabilizes societies in Africa. On Asia, really just one key effect here, and that's this long-term population growth. They are already immune to the diseases that the Europeans are bringing. You see here a map of the trade routes. But as a result of those new food crops, the population explodes in Asia, as well as in Europe. And you see that here after the Black Death in the 14th and the 15th centuries. The population really starts to explode, minus this little mini ice age right here. And that's a result of the food crops that are boosting that. Yes, some people left Europe, right? You have voluntary migrations to the Americas, and you have some deaths from diseases of the Americas, but by and large, the population grew as a result of the Columbian Exchange. All right, one more question, and then I'll finish, pause it, and come back for the answer. All right, what is the most important cause of the demographic changes? It's B, those New World food crops that are boosting the population in Afro-Eurasia and the spread of epidemic diseases that are decimating the population in the Americas. All right, did I put the question on the next slide? No. Yes, I did. Perfect. All right, so I'm going to end here reminding you this is the question that you're answering. You need to choose what you think was the most influential or the most important impact. I've given you many to choose from. Focus on just one. and then make the case that it was the most influential because of some reason. And to do that, it would help if you had a counter argument. So, for example, one impact of the Columbian Exchange was the growth in the European population. However, the most influential impact of the Columbian Exchange was the spread of diseases from Europe to the Americas because it led to so many deaths. And then in your body paragraph, you need some evidence like the amount of deaths, why the deaths were so high, right? Use the information from this PowerPoint or from the textbook or from your other notes to help you make the case. All right. Work hard. Ask me questions in the chat. I'll see you next time.